Tourette's podcast is not a medical advice show. It's a show about experiences. In the course of that, we may talk about medications or therapies or stories from the doctor's office, but don't mistake any of that for medical advice or direction. It's not. Get that only from people or places licensed or certified to give it. Not from a massively fun and action-packed podcast about our life experiences. Such as
when you see your kids suffering with something that you yourself don't really understand, your expectations, you rethink sort of what your kid's life is going to be, because you start to question, like, is he going to be able to do well in school, or is he going to be able to go on to college or have a career that he's happy with or have a life he's happy with? And now that I'm sort of at the other end of this and I see, okay, he's 15 and now I see a place for him. Like, he's funny and he's strong and he's a lot of things that he is because he had to go through this adversity at a younger age.
This is Tourette's podcast, made possible with support of the Tourette Association of America and part of the Geeks Rising Network. Hey everybody, it's Ben. Loving the tattoos that you've sent in. I think it was last episode where I mentioned the mental health tattoo thing and getting a reminder to myself on my skin to stop and breathe. Just the power of breathing to kind of thin out a stressful scenario. Some of you sent in your own mental health accomplishment reminder tattoos, and a couple of them were similar to one that I remember discussing with a couple friends at the start of the year, where it's like a semicolon, like, you know, you could have stopped, but you kept going, not being the end. I think that's kind of a popular mental health tattoo, resiliency tattoo. There's also the EKG reading, like the little line graph of things going up and down, but progressing sure enough. Or at least that's the analogy. A couple of you mentioned that tattoo. Chris in the UK shared his in the discussion group on Facebook. He's got some characters tattooed on his back, spelling out a haiku. And it says, "Burdened with dark thoughts, I climbed the hill to find wild roses blooming." Which I love. That's Chris's tattoo. Visualization always works really well for me. Like something that's conveyed in a phrase or a poem or a photograph or something. That definitely works. Like, I've been trying to get to know a lot of the scientific stuff about my experiences. Like, you know, like what's actually happening in my brain when I experience, say, anxiety. What's the evolutionary purpose of anxiety? Why is this happening to me? And that satisfies the part of my brain where I can kind of put the negative behind glass, kind of separate it out from my brain and try to observe it like an outsider, like a scientist looking at the disease under the microscope. And so the anxiety doesn't feel like it has so much identity control over me, like it's something I can isolate, even though I'm experiencing it. But the other half is that I need a visual follow through, like the haiku that Chris has tattooed on his back. The door's still open for this. If you want to send me your mental health tattoo, I would love to share it on the show, or at least describe it. If you can also include a few words about why it helps you. Thanks everyone for that. That'll be a standing thing, your mental health tattoos and why they help you. I have a question here sent in from a listener named Noah, who says, "Ben, how do you get a tattoo if you have tics?" And this is like the tattoo episode. I don't know. Tattoos aren't, at least not for me, they're not the most relaxing experience to get. And maybe there's something in there where it kind of transcends and puts you in the zone where tics aren't much on your mind. I don't know. I say you. I can only talk about it from my own experience. But I do remember, shout out to my friend Josh, who gave me my last tattoo. I never mentioned Tourette to him, but I do remember a couple times while he was working on me, it was a tattoo on my arm where my muscle tensing tics were happening. And I don't know, I was able to get through it. Again, maybe because the pain was foremost on my mind. I think we talked about this in a past season of Tourette's podcast. But the door's open. If you have input on this, if you have Tourette and experience getting tattoos, send it in. I'd love to hear what you guys think. tourettespodcast@gmail.com, or you can ask it in the discussion group on Facebook. Thanks, Noah. Also, some new members to thank at the Tourette's Podcast discussion group: Jason, Colt, and Andrew. I saw your names in the past couple days. Thank you for joining. Real quick, at tourettespodcast.com right now is a YouTube video. I was the guest on the Dappy Hour variety show Christmas special. Daphne, the amazing host who produces the whole thing, had me on as a guest to talk about Tourette and photography. And it was a lot of fun. You'll see what I mean when I talk about Daphne's creativity. It's really funny and it's really thoughtful. Check it out at tourettespodcast.com. Okay, and a quick congratulations to someone in the community I've been getting to know, Becky, the Dreadful Barber. Congrats on your marriage. That's awesome. Becky got married. We will talk with her soon after the honeymoon stuff dies down. Our guest this week is really great, has a really interesting angle on the TS world. Her name's Christina. She doesn't have TS herself, but she is the mother of a teenager with it, and she's a school teacher. And you can imagine all the questions I'm about to ask her. And this is interesting. Compared to other things we sometimes hear on the show, she said school is where her son thrives. Like, that's where he manages his tics. And when he's home, it's different. The tics really come out. So school is kind of the right environment for him to have some authority over his ticking. This is the right episode for parents because this is pretty much all about Christina's experience in that position, going through the literature online and finding all kinds of conflicting things and trying to figure out what's up and going to the doctor and on and having this acute awareness of the quote unquote suffering in her son and that drive to do something about it because you're a caring parent, but meanwhile, not trying to make excuses for him at school or with other parents and so on, trying to keep it from being the only thing that you want to talk about. And then the realization that he's actually doing great being himself, her son being mature and funny and really smart and well-informed, and how maybe it was the early exposure to adversity and challenge that might have had something to do with that. Of course, as long as that support is there. And if you're a parent listening to this, you've probably at least got that part down. But lots of really nice note-taking material here for parents, especially in the early part of trying to figure out what's going on. So pens out. Hopefully, for some of you, it's like the position Christina was in of not really having community and then hearing someone else describe his or her life like a stranger talking about their life and it ringing every bell inside your own head. And then basically getting your hidden confidence affirmed that your child's going to be okay. And not only that, but is really going to knock it out of the park with some unique kind of talent or superpower to really absorb all kinds of things in this world. We talk a bit about being an autodidact. And one thing to point out here, just in case it stands out to you, because I do occasionally get emails about this potential cause of Tourette syndrome and similar tic disorders. This is while Christina is discussing her experience and trying to figure out what was going on with her son. She describes some observations she had, and they're ones that you might find if you spend some time Googling Tourette and what causes it, specifically the figuring of a potential connection with strep or some kind of bacteria to Tourette syndrome or some other kind of tic disorder. Just so there's no miscommunication from Tourette's podcast, I will say that the science isn't quite there on that, on a causal connection between strep and tics. So don't mistake our discussion as that of an endorsement or it being some kind of fact. Again, this was her discussing her experience. So we're not saying that's the science, even though there is some commentary about exploring that. This is just part of her story and her exploration of the tics and other behavior in her son. Just repeating that the science so far doesn't support that strep infections cause TS or symptoms to blow up. In the show notes with this episode at tourettespodcast.com, I'll put a link to a study and an associated write-up. That's just a tiny piece early on in the conversation, so just wanted to underline that for you. But overall, this conversation is a really great reminder why I need to have more parents on the show. I think TS parents experience kind of a unique kind of life and major revelations of community in their journey to figure out what's going on. And it's fortunate we have Christina because she also talks about it from her position as an educator. Really valuable here. Here's me and Christina.
My name is Christina Widener. I live in Maryland, East Coast, outside of DC. I have 2 kids, and my oldest child has Tourette syndrome. He's 15, and I'm also a teacher, as well as a writer, and I've done freelance writing and stuff. So that's me.
So being a parent of a young man with Tourette and also being a public school teacher, I mean, that gives you a pretty interesting angle on all of this. And just from the top, so we can kind of build out from here. And I'm asking this as somebody with Tourette syndrome, but not being a parent myself. But knowing that we do have parents out in the audience in the early stages of this and trying to figure it all out. What do you think are some of the big gaps in knowledge, maybe 1 or 2 things that we can help to close today? Like for people in the position of parenting someone with TS or maybe even a similar diagnosis and having to sort out the best way through education. What do you think are a couple of the big pieces to address?
I think probably one of the biggest lessons is it's such a like there's a visual that I saw that the Tourette's Association of America uses with this iceberg.
Yep, the iceberg.
And I think that's probably one of the best visuals, that Tourette's disorder is this iceberg, and what you see is this tip, but everything underneath is what you don't see. And you have to really relearn a lot of parenting, and I won't even say relearn, you have to rethink a lot of parenting and a lot of the way you educate and a lot of behaviors that you used to perceive to mean one thing, and the antecedent of those behaviors being related to this Tourette syndrome, this neurological disorder. A lot of things about my son, we didn't start out with a Tourette's diagnosis. So I guess I could start there. The journey for him started with a OCD tic disorder diagnosis. And he actually was someone who had this abrupt onset of tics, and he also was diagnosed with pandas. And I'm not sure if you've had anybody come on and talk about pandas at all, but that could be like a whole nother episode.
Yeah, I've had a couple people who've had that diagnosis, but we haven't really dove into it.
It's kind of, yeah. So his diagnosis for Tourette's was such a relief to me, because I knew it. And so I said, okay, now I know this is the name of this thing. It's not OCD tic disorder. It's not going away. And when I look back, even before he had a year where he had like 9 chronic strep infections, and one strep infection, and this was actually when he was like in kindergarten, I think, came with tics that I actually thought they looked like almost like he was having a seizure. And he also had a rash on his body. He didn't have any other symptoms of strep. But I remember him very vividly watching SpongeBob, and he was holding his face, like he was holding his eyes open because he couldn't keep them from blinking. But at the time, I didn't know why he was doing that. And then his arm started sort of, jerking and sort of hitting himself. But it looked more like a seizure, because it looked very obviously that he was not in control of that. And I remember taking him to the doctor, the pediatrician, and I was like, look, I need you to look at my son right now. What he's doing, he was not doing this yesterday. And he has this rash on his body. What is going on with him? Like at this point, I'm like, I was thinking the worst. I was like, this terribly worried parent. And the doctor looked at me and said, okay, let's test him for strep. So he got tested for strep. And then he said, I'll be right back. I'm going to print something up for you. And I know it's going to sound crazy, but I'll be right back. And I think this doctor must have just learned about pandas, because he came back with I remember 17 pages printed from the internet, like these medical articles about pandas. And he said, I think this is what your son has. And we got antibiotic and whatever. And I did notice when he was on the antibiotic that that jerking and that, the really violent sort of contortions he was doing, that sort of disappeared. Now, cut to, he's 15 and he has Tourette's disorder. So where does that fit in sort of this realm of pandas? He ended up getting his tonsils and adenoids out, and he wasn't plagued with strep anymore. And there were behaviors that certainly improved. And he had what I guess I would define as sort of these mild tics, but there was also a lot of other things. So if I want to look even before the episode of this infection, and I want to think about him as a baby, as a toddler, there were things he did that I never recognized at the time as being tics. But now, I look back and I'm like, yeah, when he would twitch his head or flap his hands or move his tongue a certain way, I mean, I realized he was born with this. And certainly the strep infection, no doubt, put him in this bullseye of this disorder that was somehow coded in his DNA. So anyway, so when we did finally get to this Tourette's diagnosis, it was because he moved on to what is, defining Tourette's, which was these vocal tics. For him, it was like a cough. And I remember my first trip to children's, neurology, and I thought it was fascinating that the doctor asked me. She wanted to know as far back as like my pregnancy with him, how thorough that appointment was, and she was like, "Yeah, he has Tourette's disorder," and it was like, oh, like finally, this is what this is. So that it had a name, and I could sort of tell people this is what it is. But the hardest part, I think, about from the parent perspective is people don't see the Tourette's all the time. And what they see is something different. And it's not that I'll say they don't believe you, but it sometimes can feel like that. Like, well, no, he just behaves this way, or this is just, you're making a bigger deal of it than it is, because your kid has Tourette's at home 100-fold times worse than they ever have it with their friends and their extended family and school. And so it's hard for people to understand what this disorder does to your home and what this disorder does to your child trying to sort of maneuver their way through the world. And your lens as a parent, kind of navigating that for yourself, because you are, as a parent, you're only as happy as your least happy child. I think there's that saying, and there's some truth to that. So you have to figure out a way to help your kid along with also sort of learning how to cope as a parent with it.
What was he your first born?
Yes. Okay. Yeah. And my daughter does not have Tourette's, but I was so fearful that she would. I was like, I can't have two. And I know that there's some people that have kids and they all have Tourette's, or there's multiple, so it does make me think there's things that are coded in your DNA. And I listened to your podcast with Adam Curry. It was so good. Because I thought what he talked about was something I could never really articulate to people, but he talked about his brain being sort of wired in this way where he sees correlations and patterns, and he related it to his career with tech. Yeah. And I thought, oh my gosh, was that like the most revealing, like so well articulated as to how I see my kid. And I used to think my kid was this like amazing genius. I'm like, oh, my kid, he's like so smart. And I never connected the way his brain was to his disorder or syndrome until I went to the youth rally day and I met these kids from all over the country. And I was kind of cracking up. I was like, oh, wow, you're all amazing. Like everybody in this group has like this special talent, or is like wickedly funny, or has this.
That's good to emphasize, really, that there is, and I think I called it like the Tourette edge or something recently, and I don't mean it to say like it's a better or a better disorder than any other, but it does seem to be, for one reason or another, whether it's the challenge or whether it's the sort of isolation and the practice that you can kind of discover in that time, but there is like a proclivity that we often see in people with TS, and it's as we've heard a few people say this too, that it's important, I think, to kind of allow some of that alone time so you can kind of discover these talents that you have and really kind of flesh them out, and even allow the encouragement of pursuing it if you want. I mean, I flip-flopped a million times on what I thought I wanted to do, but I really can draw a single line through everything I've done professionally with what I was kind of good at when I was a kid, from the kind of creative side, and just kind of being by myself and practicing it, and having time for friends and stuff like that too. But it's important to point out that I think that that there is kind of something special that can come along with it.
Yeah, and it seems to be the case for people that have sort of a handle on it, in terms of the mental health piece, because I do, when I think about the crisis point in my son's life, that occurred in 4th grade. And that was when it was no longer a disorder that was affecting him in a mild way. And it was, now looking back, I see that his body was like really betraying him, and it caused a lot of anxiety for him because he didn't understand. it was like, why is this happening? And it was kind of a chicken and the egg kind of thing. I thought he suffered, like from anxiety, but really, I think the fact that he didn't have an understanding of what was happening with his body actually triggered the anxiety, which would make perfect sense, because if your body's doing something you don't really have control over, and you're in this setting where that's not acceptable, and you're surrounded by people that might not understand, it's going to create this, feeling of fight or flight. And he was definitely a kid that like struggled that year in school. And I had to really kind of step in and become his advocate, which is tricky because it was also my employer. So,
ooh, okay, yeah.
Well, he wasn't at my school, so that's important to note. And I do say, like, he has, at that time he had, I actually tell people this, that I feel that we've been surrounded by the right people at the right time, and there's something divine to it, because in life, you're going to always have people that think they know what Tourette's is, or they think they know why you're acting a certain way. And then you're going to have people that just seek to understand, and they don't come with a sort of preconceived notion or judgment. And that year he had a teacher that took I want to understand what's going on with your child. And then she became his advocate. And this person is still in his life. I mean, she is no longer, she retired from teaching, but she sends him birthday cards. And she gave me a lot of hope, actually, and had said, always, your son is going to go on to do great things. Trust me. And that was something at the time I think I really needed to hear, because when you see your kids suffering with something that you yourself don't really understand, your expectations, you rethink sort of what your kid's life is going to be, because you start to question, like, is he going to be able to do well in school, or is he going to be able to go on to college, or have a career that he's happy with, or have a life he's happy with? And now that I'm sort of at the other end of this, and I see, okay, he's 15, and now I see a place for him. Like, he's funny, and he's strong, and he's a lot of things that he is, because he had to go through this adversity at a younger age. But I do remember, and one thing that really hit me was when I was on this youth rally day, and we were with other, learning about the disorder, really. There's a really high rate of suicide in the Tourette's community. And that,
awful.
Oh my God, that shook me. Like, I remember having chills and thinking, oh God, if you didn't, if you had to go through this alone, or you had parents, it is totally stressful, but it's also it could be so very isolating. So.
Yeah. Support the home, and having at least somebody around you that gets where you're coming from, or at least will allow you to talk, is just so massive. And especially, when you're feeling, I still have this like inferiority thing, and that is just a holdover from when I was a little kid. I had encouragement, like my parents encouraged me, but in the going through school, I did not do very well. And I had such low confidence when it came to education, even though I thought, in some different kind of environment, that I could get what was going on. Or, when I was home, I knew it. I knew the subjects and everything like that, but I was terrible at test taking. And someone in the Tourette's podcast discussion group was actually just talking about this, about, I think I know what's going on, like I get the right answers, when I'm just, kind of going through it with myself, but I failed the test. And there's definitely a psych out about being in this environment where you're not really getting the support you need, and the message you're receiving from your teachers is more of, you're inadequate, or you need to do something else, and instead of just kind of being encouraged or identified for what you're good at, and maybe moving a few different pieces around to, kind of create a new path. And that is something I wanted to ask you about too, because you mentioned, the challenges, and when you said he was at a different school, but you had to go to your employer. I assume you're talking about the central office,
yeah,
like the school
sort of
district,
like the school system.
Were they primed on any of this stuff? Had they had to deal with other? Have they had experience with other kids with TS or other kind of neurological disorders where some kind of education plan needed to be formed, or?
Yeah. And I think actually Maryland, speaking, if I compare it to other states, is pretty good, in terms of getting your, in terms of education and public education. But your system can be great, but you're always dealing with individuals within that system and what their perceived notion is about certain disorders. So to qualify for special education, it's a tricky process, So my son was actually given a 504 plan, which actually served him very well. That was what he needed.
Yeah.
And then there was a time when the condition got a lot worse and he did need an IEP. And now he's in virtual learning, which I thought he started his first year of high school. And I thought virtual learning would be great for him because I see the tics are getting they're terrible right now. But he explained to me, he's like, they're bad right now because I'm home all the time and I'm not in school. And he said, I know that sounds weird, but school is the way I manage my tics. So, I think it's a matter of like, he would just dig into a book or dig into something and sort of focus his mind on something. It's not happening virtually like it would. And he also would focus his energy on his interactions with people. He's an extrovert, so he always wants to be around people. So this virtual learning, while I'm sure it works for some kids with TS very well, it's not really working for my kid, unfortunately. And I thought it would. I was kind of relieved. I'm like, oh, at least now that you won't have to worry about. And he's like, yeah, but I would just take a break, or I would walk in the hall, or I would, I would figure it out kind of. But now I'm sort of stuck in my house, and there's no end in sight. There's no like, oh, you're going back to school on this day. We're just kind of hanging out until our numbers and our percentages go down with coronavirus.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
It is a bummer. It's such a bummer. But as far as like my experience with TS as a teacher, I had one student. I've been doing this I'm teaching, I think I'm in my 20th year. And before my son, I had one student with this disorder, and I didn't see it in class impact him. And I remember there being like a really lengthy IEP, but he was a highly able student, and he was like really super smart. And I never saw the impacts or the tics, or I never saw any of it. So I didn't have much experience as a teacher with it. So I can only imagine and I hold that to myself, thinking about other teachers that have to teach my kid. Well, if I only had one kid, they probably haven't had too many come along with this. Now you're seeing it more. And I don't know if it's because there's more prevalence of it, or we're just getting better at diagnosing it. And I think it's more about a diagnosis because it took so long for my son to get this diagnosis, and he had tics for years. I mean, years. He was like OCD tic disorder. And then people would say, well, is that like Tourette's? And I'm like, I guess, like, I think so.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. But
in that time period when you were kind of moving from different diagnosis to diagnosis, was there a difficulty in finding community?
I had no community, and I felt very much on my own. And even with a PANDAS diagnosis, there's a lot of people and doctors that don't really believe that exists. So there's, it's really, I'm not going to say I was gaslighted, but I definitely didn't feel the community that I felt the first time I mean, when I went to this youth rally and I met other parents and I talked to them, and I was like, holy crap, like, this is my life. I had to go to DC and meet people through the Tourette's Association of America before I actually talked to another parent whose story was so much like my own. And it's hard because you want to talk to your friends and family about this. But then there's also this reluctance to constantly, because it absorbs and it completely overtakes your world, it's not necessarily what your friends and family always want to hear about. So if they're just calling you out of the blue and they're like, oh, how are you? And you're like, fine, but really you want to be like, this was a terrible day because XYZ happened. It's not always something you have the energy to talk about with somebody who's never experienced anything like this.
Definitely.
I actually found community, believe it or not, with some friends that I have whose children have autism. And they were very much like a support system for me. But I also felt sort of guilty because I'm like, I really shouldn't be complaining to you, because I always felt like that's a big diagnosis too. And that's a lot to handle. And so I
Yeah.
didn't want to burden my friends who might be dealing with something that I perceive to be worse. And I'm not saying it is worse. I'm just saying that was my perception. Like, my kid has this, your kid has this. You
Sure.
know,
Yeah.
but yes, I didn't have there wasn't much of a community until I had that diagnosis, and then the neurologist said, "Oh, there's this camp, you can do this, or there's this Tourette's Association of America, you can contact them." Um, and that's when I sort of got sort of more information about it. I guess I could have looked at it myself, but I was confused. Like, until a doctor said, "This is what your kid has," even though I thought that's what he had,
Hmm.
it wasn't real to me until I had that diagnosis. So I couldn't really move forward with all those other things until I had that diagnosis.
That makes sense. I think that makes total sense because it's such a it's such a thing, and it's so misunderstood. And when you see it on TV, it doesn't even look real. And then learning, kind of like digging in deeper and learning about all the different facets of it. I mean, I can definitely see how that would be kind of a fire hose of realization. I mean, did it feel like that, or you had mentioned getting the diagnosis kind of in title felt good because you had some pronouncement and probably some direction at that point. But I mean, when the diagnosis hit, what was your kind of flow of information and reality like with it?
It was funny because it didn't necessarily change the course of action for me, but it felt like a relief that I had
Yeah.
a name. I had a name for it. And I did let go. I mean, there's also, I struggle still with this even now. I struggle with this idea that he started with being, pandas. And that is this big thing where you can really go down a rabbit hole of trying everything to fix. In other words, like, there's all these treatments you could do, or you could try, with it being on antibiotic for several years, or you could try all kinds of stuff. And I didn't do that. And I do have access to John Hopkins and really good hospitals. Um,
Yeah.
and I always wondered, like, should I have done that? Could I have cured my son? This idea that maybe there is this cure, but when I would kind of let go of that a little bit, I just was like, no, we have to live with this. Like, we have to figure out how to function and live, because I don't even know what's, with pandas and this, and you just didn't know what was real, like what.
Hmm.
And I do think, the one thing I do hope, silver lining with the coronavirus, is that they will find a connection, because there's got to be connective tissue between, you have these COVID-19 patients that are now experiencing these long hauler symptoms and these other things that seem so unrelated, but have been triggered by a virus.
Oh, so you mean the neurological stuff that's been in the
Yes,
headlines?
and I'm like, I hope in their research that they'll find some connection to other people that suffer from disorders, with there being some connections to virus, bacteria, or whatever it is, and then maybe treatment could become a little bit better. So we'll see what happens. But I was reading an article about a woman who suffered from this long haulers, and she was talking about how hard it was because the doctors necessarily didn't believe her at first. And I'm like, gosh, I so relate to this because of this medical journey my son's been on since, he's been a preschooler. But now it's just, it is
Hmm.
Tourette's. That's what we call it. That's how we handle it. And that's how he accepts it and goes about his life.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I'm going to have to ask the Tourette science community, I guess, what they're thinking right now and what they're looking at, what they already know potentially, because I'm definitely not a fountain of scientific information. But I do care about the experience. Like that's mainly my focus here on is your experience as a parent and the sort of recalibration that you had to do and the acceptance piece. So there's the acceptance of reality that, oh God, I have this. And then there's the self-acceptance challenge. And, that's something that I think everybody with Tourette, I say everybody generally, but a lot of people with Tourette have to deal with or contend with at some point. And, I sure did, because I wasn't self-accepting. There's that weird balance, I think, of setting your boundaries with how much it's going to be part of your identity and part of your life. And, I don't want to be, the mom of someone with TS, like that's not what I'm known for. That's not what my title is. But I want everything to be as, and I'm trying to avoid the word normal, but
no, I know, I get it.
It's like, this is one thing. And how people say, it doesn't define me. It doesn't. And I think that's a fair way to say it. But at the same time, it is kind of central to who you are as well. So it's kind of like finding that balance of what's going to be what. I don't want to be the photographer with Tourette syndrome. I just want to be a photographer. By the way, my story includes this thing that I've had to deal with, and with the education part. And I'm so glad we're talking about this. Have you had other parents come to you and ask you for advice on how to, kind of word it, because that's something that I think a lot of other parents have had a difficult time with is getting their school district to honor it, to recognize it. And how do you be prepared as a parent to have that conversation with the school district and say, this is what we think needs to happen for my son or daughter's education?
I think that's why the diagnosis is very important. And I have had parents come to me, and I've also had parents, I've also made it a point to reach out to parents of kids within my own school. So if I know of a student that has that diagnosis, I always try to reach out to that parent and just tell them, hey, I'm also a parent of a child with Tourette syndrome. And if you ever have any questions or concerns, or you want to talk to me just as parent to parent, please reach out. I even referred someone to the Tourette's Association of America. Actually, I was like, have your child apply to be a youth ambassador. That was actually life-changing for myself and my kid. In that, it was really interesting too, because we talk about community. It's also very scary to have that community. And my son was very, it was a mix between, he was in awe and he met really amazing people and he had this amazing experience. And then he was also fearful because he saw kids who were much more severe than him. And it was like a mirror being held up. And I remember one night he was very upset and was like, is that going to be me? Like, am I going to be that kid? And I don't know, you might be it's like, I think you guys have talked about this on your podcast before about tics being suggestive and sort of contagious in the Tourette's community.
Yeah.
And I thought that was really fascinating because in some ways it sort of discourages having a community of friends with Tourette's because you're like, I don't want to catch that one, that tic you have. But at the same time, nobody understands your life better than someone else who has a similar life experience as you. So I do try to reach out to parents. My school district has been pretty great about it. If you have a diagnosis of Tourette's, I mean, you can get a 504 plan pretty easily because it's a health condition. And a lot of kids, the kids that I have seen with Tourette's are, so much of them are so smart. Like their brain is just unbelievable. And sometimes a 504 plan is all it takes, just some accommodations, some movement breaks. And really having an IEP or a 504 is kind of, it's really dependent. It's more of a communication tool because obviously it's really hard to follow plans to the letter of the law in the moment. But what it does is it immediately shows your teacher hey, this is something I have. These are things that help me be a better student. And this impacts me as a student in the classroom. And I would imagine when you were growing up, I don't remember. I'm in my 40s. I don't remember any kids having Tourette's disorder. And I feel bad for any that did, because I'm sure, being in school in the 80s, we were not very kind to them. My son has never really been made fun of by his peers for his Tourette's. Honest to God.
The Tourette Association of America is the premier nonprofit working to raise awareness, advance research, and provide ongoing support to those with Tourette syndrome or tic disorder. With a network of over 130 chapters, support groups, and centers of excellence, the TAA engages with communities across the nation in an effort to provide tools, webinars, workshops, and support for all seeking assistance. As a primary sponsor of Tourette's podcast, the TAA supports the authentic conversations showcasing the diverse representation of the TS community. To learn more, visit tourette.org, TOURETTE.org.
I've sensed a lot of change, and I don't know it because I'm not, going to school right now. I don't know what it's like to be a 15-year-old in the year 2020. But back in the day, I mean, yeah, my confidence issues were pretty terrible. Even when I was kind of fronting, like, I mean, I was kind of a clown. I acted out a lot, and I definitely misbehaved a lot. But I think a lot of that was just like my way of trying to channel my feelings of inferiority. I think I was kind of overcompensating here and there, but I really didn't feel that sense of support. My parents definitely supported me, but in the school, I think one of the things that helped me out was I went to a very small school for elementary school, and it was basically the same kids year to year. It was a very, small classrooms, maybe like, 20 students. And so they knew me. I was old material by, second or third grade. And Tourette was also not something that I felt I needed to be ashamed of because I didn't really understand its context out in the world and what pop culture was doing to it. Mm-hmm. But I still got made fun of, and I definitely still had inferiority. I didn't feel confident around girls or whatever. And I feel like I sense change now just because I see so many young people owning it on social media. And that's not to say that bullying doesn't exist. That's not to say that everybody's having a cakewalk. But it's really encouraging to see how much ownership there is out there. Kids on TikTok and Instagram stories and doing a lot of education stuff and Q&A and making YouTube videos about it. It's really cool to see. And I guess the optimistic side of me hopes that is having a, like the positive that we are seeing these days, even though it's not positive for everybody, the increase in that I hope is connected to the fact that more people are opening up about it.
Yeah, I think definitely that helps. The one thing that's hard for people to understand though, and it goes back to that iceberg, is it's the Tourette's that you don't see, or you totally don't, it's the behaviors that you don't associate with Tourette's, but it still is. And for example, like you mentioned, you're a class clown. Well, I mean, that's like you described my son. He can't shut up. He can't stop with his mouth.
Yeah.
and I do recognize that. And actually podcasting is like a perfect thing if that's really because
that's true.
But I think that's really part of the syndrome because it's like, he doesn't have a governor like for his words. And sometimes he'll say things and they're so funny and you're like, oh my gosh, you can't say that. Like, why'd you just say that? And there's a lot of comedians there's so many comedians that have Tourette's, but I think that's part of the syndrome. I think it's part of the way the brain works. And his brain is like supercharged all the time until he goes to sleep. And he's actually someone now that actually ticks in his sleep, which that's like a new thing for me as a parent. I was like, oh man, and hopefully that's just because he's in puberty, so this is what they say, parents out there, is that when your kid's in puberty, that's when the Tourette's is the worst. So we'll find out. I'm kind of hoping, because he wasn't doing that when he was younger. But those behaviors in school, that doesn't look like Tourette's. That just looks like a kid being a jerk to the teacher, or that just looks like, you know what I mean? So that's the part as a parent that's really hard. If you're advocating for your kid, it kind of looks like you're making excuses for your kid sometimes too. So we try to it's a really fine line for parenting. Like we have to be kind of hard on him and say, look, you can't wear out your welcome. That's kind of what we say. You really have to pay attention to people around you and think about the fact that you can't be the only voice in the room. You have to be a listener. You have to do this, you have to that. And that's something that I think if you have this syndrome, because there's all kinds of stuff that goes with it. I've heard someone say Tourette's plus before, and that's not that they call the disorder Tourette's plus because it's ADHD and OCD and all this other stuff.
Yeah.
But I actually think it's just Tourette's. I just think some people are good at managing all those other things, and other people are like, it's harder. So, I tried to explain to someone, because the whole ADHD thing, I said, if you think my son had that diagnosis, and we actually took it away, because I said, I don't know that it is ADHD in the sense that other kids that just have ADHD have ADHD. I said, it's the antecedent of his inattention, I do think, is his Tourette's. Like, it's the, if you think about someone that's always trying in an environment like school to not have a tick, if that's always what they're sort of trying to hide, you're distracted. You're not going to be able to focus 100% on what you're doing, and your emotions are going to be sort of on the edge too, because you're kind of like, you're going to have a much quick trigger for frustration than than your classmate that doesn't have that going on inside their head the whole time. It made sense for me because somebody talked about at the Tourette's Association of America's training for the Youth Rally Day, one of the trainers was talking about tics of the mind. And I had never thought about that before as a parent. I was like, oh my gosh, that is so good. And I'm so glad somebody said that, because it makes so much sense to me. And I think if you're having tics of the mind, you're not going to be able to focus on sitting still in your chair or doing something traditionally school-like. And you're going to look like the clown or the person that can't stop making noises or tapping your pencil or whatever these behaviors are that distract your teacher and your classmates. So that's what's really hard to navigate, especially at the elementary level.
Yeah. And I definitely hear what you're saying about maybe the perception from the outside that this is just you making an excuse for the behavior or something. And, and I'm not saying that, doesn't actually happen sometimes, but it's kind of, I think, goes into that empathy piece as well. And I've thought about this, about even when I've been misjudged and someone thinks I'm playing it up, or they're just annoyed by my ticking. I'm not saying I honor that, but I definitely understand why they, where they're coming from, I guess. And so I've kind of, I guess, added some kind of, right or wrong, I don't know. I've added this other little layer to it that, I'm coexisting with other people in this world, and they're going to make some, challenging assessments of me, and I'm going to have to deal with that. And, I know how they form these thoughts based on their own experiences or their lack of knowledge. I can't expect everybody to be an expert on all the diagnoses I have. And I'm sure that I've made unfair conclusions about other people, and just kind of balancing all that out. I just think it's, the thing that I hope prevails for everybody is just slowing down in our judgments about what's going on, so we can give people kind of time to do their thing and calibrate. And it's difficult to do. It's difficult to be tolerant of things that you perceive as being annoying. But it's like I hope we at least, if we can't possibly be experts on everything that everybody's got going on, that we at least kind of chill out around each other. And I don't think you're evil because of the person you're voting for, or it's just, the iceberg is such a potent example, and I love it that it's made the rounds like it has, because it's so true. And Tourette is, the definition of it is the sort of co-occurrence of these vocal and motor tics, and but all these things that come with it. I've heard a couple Tourette scientists say that tics are symptoms of, or maybe not symptoms, but signs of other things to look out for. And this is where you can talk about the depression, anxiety, sleep issues, OCD, all these other things that come along with it. And there have been conversations about even renaming Tourette syndrome to something else that kind of better captures a lot of this stuff. And there's some debate about that, but
that's interesting. But you have a very enlightened sense of self, and to get to that point, and that's going to be profound for my son if he's getting there, and that's because you do have to, and he does actually, it's funny because sometimes he'll have like a tick fit, I guess I would call it, and he'll
Yeah.
apologize. Like he'll be like, I'm sorry. Like it's
Yeah.
almost like he acknowledges that it is kind of annoying or that it's bothering. And when
I
he
still do that. Yeah.
yeah, like I don't feel like he needs, and I'm like, you don't have to apologize to me. Like I'm your mom. Like I he's like, I know, but that's annoying, you know. And then he says, it is annoying. Like we are annoying, like people with Tourette's. He's like, we're really funny though. And we have he was joking about how he follows a lot of the kids on Instagram, and he's like, gosh, they're so funny. Like they have like the best memes and stuff that they put up
Yeah.
about Tourette's. And I didn't realize like we're all pretty funny.
Yeah.
But it is true. Like we're in this society now where it's like, you're right. Like that iceberg could represent a lot of things, not just Tourette's. And we do have to really like open up and talk about this stuff. And you know, it is okay to say, yeah, that's kind of annoying, but it's not, you know, it doesn't define my judgment of you, or we can coexist, or we can, you know, we can live, you know, harmoniously and figure this thing out together.
Has this changed how you go about teaching and engaging with other youths?
Yeah, it has changed everything about me, honestly. It gives me a level of empathy that I couldn't have ever possibly had for students with any kind of learning issue. And I've always felt like I've had a lot of empathy, just being a teacher and choosing to be a teacher. But I remember being that teacher that, you know, I would hear like parents try to explain away some of the behaviors of their kids, and I would be kind of skeptical. And now I don't ever do that in my mind. I'm always listening to the parent, because I know the parent knows their child the best. So it's changed my view that way. And even how I parent, it's never a day goes by where it's not there, and it's not sort of a part of our life or in our household. Now my biggest worry going forward is, will my son be able to do the things he wants to do, or will this get in the way? And I mean, like the big picture of life. For example, he really wants to join the military. Is that something that he's going to be able to do? It remains to be seen. With his tics, they'll subside enough. He's got, you know, there's certain goals for himself that I want for him. He's mentioned things like, oh, you know, I don't think I ever want to get married or have kids. And I'm like, why not? And he's like, well, I would really hate to have a kid with Tourette's. I wouldn't want to pass that on to my kid. And he doesn't say it in a way that's whiny or sad or anything. It's just very matter of fact. And he'll be like, oh, I'll just be like Madonna and Angelina Jolie. I'll adopt someone internationally. Like he jokes about it. And I'm like, Karsten, you would be an amazing parent of someone with Tourette's, because you would have every understanding of it. Like you're the perfect person to have kids. And I do think he has so much empathy for people and kids because of this. I think like it opens up your empathy wheel. 100%. So, and it's not just him. It's like a lot of kids that I meet that have this syndrome. A lot of people that I meet have a lot of empathy for others, even outside of their own sort of Tourette syndrome community.
Yeah. And I think one thing in getting that, you know, and you did address this, is the fact that there is a challenge there. And, you know, and I guess I'll acknowledge that I'm not totally qualified to weigh in on this. I think there probably has to be some degree of acceptance with, you know, thinking about the education stuff. If, you know, there's not going to be a perfect solution for every kid out there. There's always going to be, you know, maybe some kind of inconvenience or lack of accommodation that would otherwise help. But also maybe that some degree of resistance or challenge can help you cultivate these kind of real world problem solving appreciations and make you do what, you know, kind of, I guess, make do with what you have kind of mentality. And I think that's good. But of course, you know, if there's a shot at fairness, especially if it's offered and protected by law or policy, then, you know, it's important that be honored without all the challenges that parents have to go through to get it. But But, kind of regardless, there's still the resistance of just kind of learning in general, just learning something new and having to take something on and take the test. And, it's meant to be a challenge, and there's good challenge and there's bad challenge. But the good kind that I think does come with Tourette is you do get that appreciation, that empathy. It changes how you regard other people, how you view other people. And even in the past 2 to 3 years of me doing the podcast, it's definitely changed how I view myself, but also other people. Even as someone living with Tourette syndrome, for my whole life, being closeted about it and not having the conversations and hiding it, I think I robbed myself of a lot of opportunities to connect with people in different ways. And so, yeah, just that self-acceptance is a really cool thing. And I feel like it's a huge merit badge.
Yeah, it's hard to get there too. I mean, I think even any kid, not just a kid with this, but
definitely hard.
Finding that identity and how you fit in the world that's part of growing up is really hard. And like we as people go through all these different stages when we're growing up and experiment with different identities, I guess you could say, and to see where we fit. And just to have this as the added layer, that's really tricky. So that's kind of what I'm watching now sort of play out, is this sort of added layer and how this is going to play out in the end. But I'm so very hopeful and I feel very encouraged because we've come a long way. So I guess that's my one message. If you're a parent and you're at the beginning of this journey, it does get better. And you will get to a place where you're going to feel hope and you're going to feel like, okay, this is okay. And this can work. And kind of like your guest, Adam Curry, said, it's a feature, not a bug. I thought that was like the greatest quote. It was so real to me. One of my son's things about his is he can like speak 2 languages. He can learn languages. He's like a polyglot. Awesome. Yeah. And I do think that's because of his brain. He's a fluent French speaker and learned it in the first year of taking French in 7th grade. He was his teacher told me he's 1 in 10,000. And I'm like, what does that mean? She said, he's 1 in 10,000 people that can just learn languages. They're wired that way. She said, I only had one other student like this in my career as teaching. And he's at a year 7. She said he's at a year 7 of learning this language. And that was like mid-year taking the language.
Wow.
So now that's his thing. Like he's learning Spanish, and he likes, he has books on all kinds of languages. He just kind of in his spare time studies it. And I was thinking about Adam Curry talking about his brain and how he can see these pathways and how things are connected and how many people with Tourette syndrome have, they're talented artists, or you're a photographer. Like maybe you see that shot or that image that the rest of us don't see. So I think if you're in this community, like find that thing. If whatever that thing is, find it and make it work for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he sounds like, like an autodidact, and, you can just teach yourself all kinds of different things. And that's an amazing thing to have. And I'm actually like really excited for him.
Yeah, and that's actually funny because that's what his teacher said. He's an autodidact, and I'm like, I think I should know what that means. I'm a teacher. I looked it up, but yeah. So it's the funny thing is a lot of people with Tourette syndrome but they do so poorly in school, and it's just funny to me because I'm like, oh, you just have to they do really poorly in like middle school's like the worst. I think because it's like that word.
Disaster in middle school.
Oh my gosh, it's such a bad age. And I see him in high school, it's going to get easier because he doesn't have as many classes to keep track of, and the classes he's in are tailored to his interest a little more. But I remember hearing another speaker talk about this and saying it gets better, and it's even better in college, and it's even better if you go into graduate school, and it's even better in life because in life you can focus all that do what you want to do, basically. So it's really kind of just like getting your kid through school, through elementary and middle school, keeping them in one piece, keeping them happy. Happy is the biggest thing.
Thanks for listening. Thanks so much to Christina. I think she made a lot of connections we don't often hear on this podcast from her very important and valid position in the Tourette world as a parent and an educator. Figuring this all out and understanding, after all, the power of community and comparing notes and just ultimately feeling pretty good about everything. Like you're doing the right thing. I hope this helped you out, especially if you're a parent going through the frazzling stage of figuring out what's up and what it means for your child's future. Thanks again, Christina. Reminder before I let you go, Tourette.org, and click Attend an Event. You'll see the virtual Teen Summit coming right up on January 9th. I'll be presenting at that and sitting on a panel answering your burning questions. So this is one for the teenagers. Really great lineup. Sign up for it, Tourette.org. Click Attend an Event. And while you're at it, also make sure to sign up for the virtual Day of Advocacy coming up. If you're a U.S. resident, connecting with your members of Congress to talk about Tourette and the need. And there's going to be all kinds of preparation work to help you out with that. I'll be involved with this as well. And while we're on the subject of Tourette parenting, you'll also see on the calendar January 20th, Just for Dads, a discussion on Tourette syndrome and parenting. And I'll link to all of this at tourettespodcast.com. Okay, gonna let you go. Thanks for letting me post this a day late. I try not to be late with episodes, but I was just overwhelmed yesterday and I needed to spend a day in bed. Thankfully, this listening community really gets that kind of thing. More coming up. Thanks again. Tourette's podcast is made possible by the Tourette Association of America, Tourette.org, and is part of the Geeks Rising podcast network, geeksrising.com. Thanks, everybody. This is Ben.